Hi, I'm Dr. Beth McDougall, and I'm here with the world's greatest physicist, Nassim Haramein.
Thank you. I'll try to live up to that.
And you always do. So we're going to talk today about Nassim's new paper that's coming out. And one of the concepts that's coming out of the physics really is describing flow and the flow of energy throughout the universe. And what I'm particularly interested in is the flow into biological systems and how we can create greater coherency in biological systems. So
Yeah.
dive into that.
Well, you know, that's really a really powerful part of the paper is that we initiate the calculations by describing the Planck field, right? The fluctuation of space-time at the quantum scale, below the atom and billions of times smaller than the atom, as a Planck plasma.
Yeah.
So think of a plasma, right, as a gas that's highly ionized. And it's made out of protons and electrons and neutrons and so on. But imagine a plasma that's made of Planck oscillators, right? Instead, where the particle that makes up the plasma is Planck oscillators, and that acts like a superfluid across the structure of space, meaning that the space-time at the quantum level is acting like this Planck plasma fluid across all the vacuum of space, from the galactic vacuum to the Planck or the quantum vacuum.
And do you mind if I interrupt? Because I think it was really enlightening one time when I read that the Planck is to a human cell in size as the human cell is to the entire universe.
Correct.
Right?
Right.
Just to get a perspective on what we're talking about
On
here.
scales, yeah, exactly. So you were talking about something that's vastly outside our direct, experience, right? When we're talking about Planck fluctuations, the structure of space. And people have a hard time relating to that because basically I'm saying space is not empty. The atom is made out of space, 99.99999% space, and the part that's not space is a little electromagnetic or electrostatic field. And so to think that space is full is kind of weird, but there's electromagnetic waves between you and I right now, radio waves, microwave, infrared, all kinds of electromagnetic fluctuation, including background radiation from the galaxy, from the universe. I mean, all kinds of stuff going on. And you can imagine there's smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller frequencies or, wavelengths of this, electromagnetic fluctuation that eventually ends up being a wavelength in which, at the speed of light, the photon would go through itself. And that's the...
Yeah, say that again, because that's sometimes a hard one to understand. So it's like if a photon were traveling at the speed of light, the amount of time it would take to cross its own diameter
would be the bottom limit, or the fundamental limit, assuming that the speed of light is a limit, right? Which is something we
do not think.
But I believe it is a value for our scale relationship that's important.
Right, so like our scale, our macro scale of human life and biology and
cosmology, is expressing the speed because of the size of our universe and the stuff in it and all this stuff. So the pixel for our universe is defined by that speed, right? And that is that Planck pixel that is basically a photon going through itself at that speed. And so you can imagine that that's really, really teeny because the speed of light's pretty fast, right? And when you think about quantum theory and when you write formalism on quantum field theory and all this, you end up finding that stuff is everywhere, that like the quantum world, the space-time at the quantum world is like fluctuating sea of this energy. And what I've done is I've shown throughout the years, and now I've solved this completely for unification of physics, I've shown that the material world is actually an emergent effect of that sea.
Yes.
Right?
And everything emerges just out of this one thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that you have, like, the first tendency early on was to think that sea was random, and that all the fluctuations were random, and so they all cancel each other out, and so we could ignore it.
Oh, that's how it was ignored.
Right.
Okay.
And then eventually, it was found in quantum theory that, like, well, we kind of needed to produce, like, certain particles to like account for some of the things we discovered in quantum theory. And then we realized, we kind of needed to produce a expanding force in our universe at the cosmological level to accelerate our universe, which they call dark energy. And so we couldn't get away from it, and what I found is that actually it is the source of the material world altogether.
Absolutely.
and that there is functions in it that are random, right, and more incoherent, but there's functions in them, there's islands of coherencies
Out of which matter precipitates.
Which makes up matter, literally.
Right.
So in technical term, that would be called a Bose phase. A Bose-Einstein condensate is like when a plasma becomes all organized and coherent, where it acts like one wave function, right? Like all together. And so basically, but it was never actually defined in terms of its mechanics. And that's what I did writing these mathematics, is I said, okay, this Planck plasma that's at the source of everything, when it spins in regions of space, it creates a coherent behavior.
I love that. It's like the vortices and the eddies that create the information or pattern for something to emerge.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like eddy currents.
Yeah.
And you can think of it as like the water in your bath, and then you pull the plug, right? And if you have a rubber ducky there, it's going to appear like it's attracted to the drain. And Einstein basically described space-time as like the surface of the water going down the drain, the curvature of space-time.
Right.
But actually, if you look carefully, the water is made of particles that are all spinning together in a coherent matter in that region.
Right.
And that's what's making the effect. And that's what I did. I described the deeper quantum dynamics of space-time. Instead of describing it as smooth, I describe its particular dynamics as granular dynamics.
Yeah.
And so these islands of coherency is because there's a vorticular dynamic in that region, and it's making a subatomic particle, it's making a proton, it's making a neutron, it's making an electron, or it's making a star, or even a planet, or a star, or a galaxy. And and so we wrote the math for this, and it came out just right, and
Awesome.
that was what was remarkable, because we started with a Planck field, and we could account for the mass of the proton and its radius, and the mass of the electron and its radius, and then now
all of the Bohr atoms and
right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, and planetary bodies and the size of the universe.
And the size of and its temperature and
Yeah.
all these things just came out just right.
Yeah.
And
12 decimal point accuracy.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's extraordinary.
And that's in the paper we're writing today. And then, but your viewers might ask, well, what's making it spin, right? And so when we initiate the calculation, we clearly show when we initiate the calculation, we clearly show that it is spinning because there's a gradient between scales. That is, no system is isolated. Everything is interacting with this field.
Yes.
And there's gradients of density between the scales.
Right.
And so when you have a density gradient, it produces spin angular momentum.
I think we should stop on that for 1 second and talk about that, because when I think about the Planck level,
Yeah.
everything is so densely packed, and it's so potent because you have all of these little Planck oscillators so close together,
Right.
vibrating. So you have like would you say that the more quantum you go, the denser
Yes.
it is?
In terms of energy, right? And the more, like, you could think of it like the more crystalline
Yes.
it gets.
The more coherent and organized.
That's right.
Yeah.
It gets. And then further you get from that scale, more decoherency there is. And so that's why, although you have a huge amount of energy and a huge amount of forces at the Planck scale, at our scale, we only see a very little amount of it, right? And as you get bigger and bigger, you don't see as much as the energy that's available, considering the sizes that you're considering. Like, you're looking at a star, the amount of Plancks in there is significant, or the universe, but you don't see all the energy. You see a very, very small amount of the energy,
Right.
because there's a decoherency as you go up in scales.
Right, and a slowing down.
And a slowing down.
Yeah.
And exactly. And so
Yeah.
things start to look less and less energetic. And that's why we think gravity is really weak, right? And so on. And so we reconciled all these things by, in technical term, it's called a screening. By showing that basically most of the energy that's present at the source of the material world is screened away in such a way that we don't experience it directly, so we don't know it's there.
Screened away. I've never heard you say that. What do you mean?
So
Just
think of it like, imagine you have all the Plancks inside a event horizon, right? A sphere.
Okay.
So
So it's shielded from our experience, basically.
exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay,
So
that
like,
makes sense.
imagine a black hole, right? Like, most of the energy inside is
something-
unavailable.
Yeah, for us to experience.
Exactly.
Wow, that makes sense. Okay.
So only the little bit that leaks out of it is what we measure.
So one of the things we wanted to talk about today is how do biological structures emerge out of this complex field, and what dictates the flow of energy into the system to maintain the coherency of the system, and based on the physics you're currently writing, what can we do to enhance that?
Well, the main thing is that, first of all, is to realize that we're in an open system. We're not in a closed system. That is, when you analyze a proton, an electron, a person, a planet, a galaxy, whatever, if you don't consider that it's bathing in this field, and that this field scales across all scales, then you're missing the fundamental dynamics, or
Totally.
the source of the thing.
Right.
So, and in an esoteric way, spiritual people, or even religious people, might have thought of this as like biology, like the doctor examining the body only and not considering the consciousness that's in it, or not considering the soul, or whatever you want to call it. You know what I'm saying? But basically, the idea is that when you open the system, when you realize that it's in interaction that's producing the effect, from this equation, you can calculate how much energy is moving through. Meaning, imagine you have a gradient across scale, right? An energy gradient across scale from the universal size all the way to the Planck size. And in between is biology.
Right.
And so you have systems that organize into more complex system, and so on, as you go up the scales. And the result is that information is moving from one scale to the other. Information or energy is being transferred from one scale to the other with some screening. And as this energy flows, and literally it's a flow. In technical terms, in physics, it's a circulation. And this is how these equations are written. It actually produces very specific dynamics
Almost
of
like
fluid dynamics,
Yeah.
of like toroidal fields and toroidal dynamics, angular momentum in the region, and you can predict what the angular momentum should be at each level and the energy level. When you get to the biology, when you look for that, you end up looking at the mitochondria, little motors
Yeah.
that are spinning,
Yeah.
which is at the source of the energy of the cell.
Let's talk about that for one sec. So mitochondria are the little energy factories inside of your cells, little intracellular organelles that manufacture ATP from oxygen that we breathe and glucose in our bodies, run it through a series of enzymatic steps to produce ATP, which is like the energy currency of the body. But one of the ways they function is by routing protons, so hydrogen, across a membrane and with a router. And these little routers have always fascinated me so much, like they're little free energy engines
Right.
circulating incredibly fast. And so
No, they're spinning at like 8,000 RPM when they're at rest.
Yeah.
And when you're running or doing some activity or it needs more ATP, it can run up all the way to 60,000 RPM.
yeah,
And so they're spinning like,
it's just insane.
yeah,
right?
it's incredible.
And you have so many of these per mitochondrial membrane.
Right,
and then
thousands of them, right?
Yeah, and then you have, thousands and thousands of mitochondria per cell, and you have at least 37 trillion cells. And so it's like you have so many of these interacting with the field. So.
Right, huge amount of these little engines literally, transferring protons across a membrane and ripping electrons, making ATP and so on, and producing the energy level of biology, like of your existence. Without them, nothing happens, right?
Right.
And so this is really like the energy factory of the biological world. And these calculations are preliminary because we haven't addressed fully the biological side of the equations yet. We're finishing with the physics first, but it's looking really good to be able to actually describe this scaling then of the energy from the proton to the electron to eventually the cells, and then the little motor of the mitochondria being part of this energy flow across the scale in the universe.
Yep.
And so for the first time in history, accounting for biology in a physical theory, which currently is not the case. Like,
Right.
relativity, quantum theory, all this doesn't
Include biology.
It doesn't include biology. It doesn't predict it, that's for sure.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
actually predicts that there should be no such thing.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
Because under random function, it should not happen.
Statistically, impossible.
Impossible, right?
Yeah.
So this says something vastly different.
Yeah. And I think that for me, being a practicing physician for 23 years, optimizing energy production by the mitochondria in the cell is the holy grail of medicine, because every single solitary thing I see is related to mitochondrial dysfunction or slowdown in energy production over time, or
including aging.
Including aging.
Right.
So we're talking cancer, neurodegenerative diseases, chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, and aging. So literally, it's not only the holy grail, but it's also the fountain of youth. If we can figure out how to just optimize the flow of energy from the field into the biology through the mitochondrial routers.
Right.
You know, that's one of the ways. I'm sure it comes in other ways also. But.
Right. But I mean, all of a sudden you get this sense of, okay, I understand the mechanics from, you know, the creation of protons, electrons, and so on, atoms, like the reality, right? I have the mechanics of reality. I can account for stars, galaxies, and all this. If I run these equations for the universe, for instance, I get the right mass, the right size, I get the right temperature for the background radiation of the universe, all this stuff. These are analytical solutions, by the way. There's no free parameters, there's no weird stuff. I don't have to add dark energy, dark matter, that all goes away. They're beautiful and simple and clear. And they give really high level of accuracy, 12-digit accuracy on most the constants in physics, which unify as a result.
Extraordinary.
And so basically, all of a sudden I have the mechanics on how eventually the mitochondria, the little motor, the little router would come to exist. So it's a pretty short step in engineering to imagine that I would be able to like use plasma and electromagnetic fields, you know, to modify the local structure of space in such a way that I would couple to the little routers and be able to, you know, increase their energy level.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that leads to slowdown of energy production by the mitochondria over time is all of the dissonant signatures that a person accumulates as they're going through life. You know, the information signature of pathogens and of toxins and of traumatic experiences and things that we're kind of walking around with.
So, I mean, the proton chain starts clogging up and, you know, things don't flow anymore. And so the flow is interrupted.
Right.
And
this communication between the field and our biology just starts to get clouded.
Yeah.
And so I feel that part of what you're doing is really enhancing the energy to the point where you're transmuting that dissonance.
Right.
And then coupling with the routers.
Exactly, so that you can think of it as like aging is like decohering.
That's right.
And by knowing the mechanics under which that happens, you can reverse that flow so that you can recohere.
Right. And
that would be remarkable. I mean, life extension would definitely be a possibility. And it might sound weird to people when you're talking about life extension because, you know, our lives are so short, so we don't see the evolution so well. But, you know, only a few generations ago, the life expectancy in the world was like 40 years old, 45 years old, you know. But
then I think there are these really fascinating standout examples of yogis that, you know, have been reported to have lived for hundreds of years.
Correct.
And you ask,
I mean, my grandpa lived to 128.
Right.
Right.
Which is such a great story, by the way. We should even talk about that because it's such a great example of what we're talking about, honestly. But these individuals, I think, have cultivated states of consciousness that actually transmute dissonance and facilitate the flow of energy from the field into the biology to keep it more coherent over time.
Yeah.
So it's less entropy happening, less
Right.
breakdown.
Let's break down.
Yeah.
Exactly.
But okay, this story about your grandfather is so good. It's so good.
Well, it's interesting. Well, you know, he used to bring people to Mecca from Iran, and it was a 6 months camelback ride to Mecca and then back. So it was a year-long trip. And when he was going, he was bringing people that could go to Mecca, but because in Islam, everybody has to go to Mecca at least once in their lifetime. But if they can't afford it, if they can't go, they can send somebody with their prayer on their behalf with their prayer. So my grandfather was bringing the prayers of all the people that couldn't go, and so when he was there, he had, for every person, you have to turn around the central Kaaba. I don't know if you've seen the videos of this, all these people spinning around this thing.
Piece of technology.
Yeah, this device, this black stone that's described in the Sumerian text as the black sun. That's supposedly in the middle of Mecca. And so you have these thousands of people that are spinning, creating this huge vortex. Right? Like it's like what I was discussing earlier with like making a vortex with a plasma. Well, you're making it with a whole bunch of people, and so he would spend weeks spinning around there to bring the prayers of every people that couldn't go, that he would bring prayers for.
And instead of doing it once in a lifetime like a good Muslim would, he's doing it every year,
right,
as a proxy for other people. So like, that's extraordinary.
And so I believe that he lived so old because of this experience he was having of this being in this state of prayer, first of all, and then with thousands of people producing this coherent field, and then the power of that object in the middle might have had something to do with it, and the result is that although he had an extremely difficult life, you can imagine it's pretty rugged in the desert, and he had many mishap. He lost an eye at one point because he fell asleep on this camel and fell onto a cactus and lost an eye in the middle of a trip, and so on.
Wow.
And but even with all this, he lived a fairly long time. And so basically, I think, so although it might sound strange to talk about life extension, we've seen, even historically, life extension happen in a fairly short amount of time between generations as we improved, our living and our capacity to take care of ourselves and all this. But
sadly, I was just going to say, the life expectancy has just diminished for the first time in modern history.
Right.
And so there's a lot of reasons for that. But I think that
it might have to do with the amount of, chemicals,
and 5G, and all
electromagnetic noise, and all this. But so now, having these mechanics, now having this understanding, there may be a possibility, and I think it's very real, that we will be able to create a coherent field that is strong enough that
is cohering to the biology.
That's right.
And basically enhancing the resonance with the field itself, so that the energy flow is flowing better.
Right. Is at a higher level. And so you may not need to meditate in a cave for, you know, 60 years to get the flow to flow better, although it's still a good idea to meditate. You know, I think we're arriving at a point where we're gonna understand not only the fundamental energy source of the material world, but we're gonna start to understand the fundamental energy source, which is the same for biology. And then start to be able to engineer that energy source to work with it, to work with the flow, instead of working against the flow.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. So that's a great point to end on. Stay tuned for some exciting technologies, because there's a lot that are being talked about right now, and you know, in the planning stages.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. This is my good friend Nassim Haramein, and so you can look for the paper.
Yes, it will be coming out in the next month and a half or so. And it will be, I will have as well on our website, resonantscience.org, a section that will be added. So we just added a section to our course. There's about 100,000 people taking the course right now.
I love that.
Yeah.
Isn't that the largest physics institution in the world?
It must be.
It is at this point.
And there is, we just added module 7, which addressed the papers that have been published since I wrote module 6 almost 7 years ago. And now we'll be adding module 8, which will address the paper we're writing right now. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to sit with Olivier Alérol, which is the physicist I'm writing this paper with, and we're going to go through all the equations so that, and you will be amazed, it's actually pretty simple. It's all about flow. And we're going to go through all of the equations so that everybody can understand what the paper says and what it means to our understanding of our reality, of the universe, and of ourself in it.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yes. Okay, thank you so much, Nassim.
Thank you.
This is awesome.
So glad to be here.